It was time, really. The reason all of us in the Beatles shied away from Beatles material directly after the breakup.
Paul McCartney is known worldwide as one of the most talented songwriters in music history. He helped create some of the Beatles' most famous songs and has maintained a friendly public image throughout his long career. However, behind his polite and cheerful personality, McCartney has strong opinions about other musicians and bands. People close to him have seen moments when his diplomatic mask slipped, revealing sharp criticisms of artists who didn't meet his high standards. According to Denny Laine, a former Wings guitarist who spoke in a rare 2018 interview, there was always a competitive spirit between him and Paul. Laine explained that McCartney knows exactly what he likes and dislikes in music, and he isn't afraid to express these opinions when he's away from the public eye. These private views show a competitive side of McCartney that most fans never see. McCartney's musical disagreements weren't just about personal conflicts. They reflected deeper differences about how music should be made, what makes good songwriting, and what rock music should represent as an art form. His feuds with certain bands reveal important insights into how one of music's greatest figures viewed his competitors and contemporaries. The Rolling Stones. The rivalry between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones is legendary, but most people don't know how personal it became behind the scenes. While both bands maintained the appearance of friendly competition in public, McCartney has made several subtle criticisms of the Stones throughout his career. During a late-night recording session at Abbey Road in 1968, McCartney allegedly told producer George Martin that he always thought the Rolling Stones were just a blues cover band that got lucky. This comment didn't make headlines at the time, but Paul's feelings about the Stones have appeared in more careful ways over the years. In a 2021 interview with The New Yorker, McCartney couldn't resist sharing his true opinion. He said he wasn't sure he should say it, but he believed the Stones were essentially a blues cover band. He felt that the Beatles cast their musical net much wider than the Rolling Stones did. Mick Jagger responded quickly to these comments, calling the Beatles a four-piece band with one drummer, while joking that the Stones were still filling stadiums. The source of Paul's criticism seems to come from his belief that the Stones were derivative and unoriginal. Peter Brown, a former Apple Records executive, revealed that Paul always felt the Rolling Stones were following in the Beatles' footsteps. He believed the Stones would release similar album concepts months after the Beatles had already explored that territory. This tension became even more obvious when John Lennon briefly considered producing a Rolling Stones album in 1969. According to studio engineer Jeff Emmerich, Paul was visibly upset about this idea. He questioned why John would waste his talents working with the Stones when the Beatles had their own projects that needed attention. While McCartney has occasionally praised specific Rolling Stones songs over the years, the underlying competitive tension between him and the band has never completely gone away. When Rolling Stone magazine asked about the rivalry in 2016, Paul's diplomatic answer still carried a sharp edge. He said they were a great band, but they just weren't the Beatles. The Sex Pistols. If any musical movement truly irritated Paul McCartney, it was punk rock. The Sex Pistols, more than any other band, represented everything about punk that bothered him. When this anarchic group emerged in 1976 with their raw, aggressive sound and anti-establishment message, McCartney was reportedly angry about their deliberate rejection of everything he had helped build in popular music. C. John Eastman, Linda McCartney's brother, revealed in a rare 2003 interview that Paul considered the Sex Pistols' music to be an assault on his ears. McCartney couldn't understand why anyone would celebrate musicians who couldn't play their instruments properly. This attitude reflected his belief that technical skill and musical craftsmanship were essential elements of good music. The feeling between the two acts was completely mutual. When the Sex Pistols song God Save the Queen was climbing the charts during the same week that McCartney's Mull of Kintyre was also riding high, Johnny Rotten publicly dismissed Paul as a dinosaur who represented everything punk music stood against. What truly made McCartney furious wasn't just their musical approach, but their direct attacks on his legacy and the Beatles' reputation. According to Wings drummer Denny Seiwell, Paul was particularly hurt when he heard that the Sex Pistols were using Beatles posters for target practice during their rehearsals. Seiwell remembered that McCartney tried to laugh it off, but you could tell it bothered him deeply. The tension between the two camps reached its peak when both acts found themselves recording in studios next to each other at London's Air facility in early 1977. Studio manager Dave Harris remembered that Paul made a friendly gesture to introduce himself to the punk rockers. Apparently, Sid Vicious muttered something about establishment sellouts in response. McCartney turned around and walked away, never acknowledging the Sex Pistols again. Years later, McCartney would grudgingly admit that the punk movement had cleared the air in music and brought some needed changes. However, he never warmed up to the Sex Pistols specifically. During a 2016 BBC interview, when asked about the band, Paul simply replied that they were "not my cup of tea, really," with a tightness in his voice that revealed his true feelings about them. Oasis, the Britpop phenomenon of the 1990s, saw Oasis emerge as self-proclaimed Beatles disciples. Noel Gallagher openly worshipped McCartney's songwriting abilities and frequently spoke about how much the Beatles influenced his work. Most people would think this kind of admiration would flatter Paul, but behind closed doors, it apparently had the opposite effect on him. Jeff Baker, McCartney's longtime publicist, revealed that Paul found Oasis's Beatles obsession tiresome and borderline insulting. McCartney felt they were reducing his life's work to a handful of copied chords and recycled melodies. This attitude shows how protective he was of the Beatles' musical legacy and innovation. What particularly irritated McCartney was Oasis's combination of brash attitude with what he perceived as derivative music. During a private dinner in 1997, Paul reportedly told George Martin that Oasis had gotten the swagger right, but asked where the innovation was. He pointed out that the Beatles never just copied their musical heroes. They transformed and reimagined their influences into something new. The tension wasn't helped by the Gallagher brothers' notorious outspokenness and tendency to make bold claims about their own importance. When Noel claimed in a 1996 interview that Oasis was bigger than the Beatles, McCartney was furious about such comparisons. According to Beatles biographer Philip Norman, Paul called such statements ridiculous and privately dismissed the band as arrogant upstarts with half the talent and twice the ego. A particularly awkward encounter occurred at the Q Awards ceremony when both McCartney and Oasis were receiving honors. Backstage, Liam Gallagher apparently approached Paul asking for an autograph, only to be met with a surprisingly cool reception. One witness described McCartney as cordial but clearly uncomfortable throughout the entire exchange. Over the years, Paul has softened his stance somewhat and occasionally acknowledges Oasis's impact on keeping guitar music relevant during a time when other genres were dominating the charts. However, people in his inner circle maintain that he never quite got over what he saw as their shameless plundering of the Beatles' sound. When asked directly about Oasis in a 2018 GQ interview, McCartney offered a tellingly brief response, saying they had good songs, but wishing they had found their own voice. The Monkees. Few bands have drawn McCartney's quiet scorn quite like the Monkees. While most of the world saw them as harmless entertainment, Paul allegedly viewed them as a cynical corporate exploitation of everything the Beatles had pioneered in terms of band creativity and authenticity. Alistair Taylor, a Beatles assistant, revealed in his memoir that Paul considered the Monkees a plastic imitation of real bands. Taylor remembered that McCartney would change radio stations whenever their songs came on during car rides to the studio. This reaction shows how much the manufactured nature of the Monkees bothered him. The Monkees' origins as a made-for-television band particularly irritated McCartney, who had spent years developing his musical skills in Hamburg's clubs before achieving fame. During a heated discussion with Beatles manager Brian Epstein in 1967, Paul reportedly said that the Monkees were making a mockery of what the Beatles had built. He called them four actors pretending to be a band and found it insulting to real musicians. The tension escalated when the Monkees TV show began incorporating psychedelic elements after the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. According to George Harrison, McCartney viewed this as blatant theft of their artistic innovations. Harrison remembered that Paul would get properly wound up about it, saying that the Monkees were following the Beatles' blueprint without doing any of the creative work. A particularly awkward moment came at a Los Angeles party in 1968, when McCartney reportedly snubbed Mickey Dolenz by walking away in the middle of their conversation. Dolenz later recalled that he didn't think Paul ever accepted the Monkees as legitimate musicians, regardless of their later efforts to gain creative control. Despite the fact that the Monkees eventually fought for creative control and became a real performing band, McCartney's opinion never fully changed. When asked about them in a 2011 interview, his diplomatic response still carried an unmistakable edge. He said they had some catchy tunes, but they were certainly no Beatles. The Bee Gees. The disco explosion of the late 1970s saw the Bee Gees achieve unprecedented commercial success just as McCartney's post-Wings career hit a difficult period. This timing created what people close to Paul describe as a simmering resentment toward the Gibb brothers and their massive success. Producer Chris Thomas recalled that Paul felt blindsided by the disco movement. Here were three brothers suddenly selling more records than the Beatles ever did with the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, and McCartney took their success personally. This reaction reveals how competitive he remained about commercial achievement even after the Beatles had broken up. McCartney's frustration allegedly came from what he saw as the Bee Gees' transformation from Beatles sound-alikes in their early career to disco superstars. According to Wings guitarist Lawrence Juber, Paul would listen to their falsetto harmonies and complain about how they had abandoned their original sound purely for commercial gain. He saw this as selling out their artistic integrity. The rivalry intensified when both acts were recording at the same Miami studio in 1979. Studio manager Tony Bongiovi remembered that Paul would schedule his recording sessions specifically to avoid running into the Bee Gees. When someone mentioned that the Bee Gees had broken another chart wreck, McCartney would visibly tense up, showing how much their success bothered him. What particularly irritated McCartney was the critical acclaim the Bee Gees received during their disco period. When they were hailed as songwriting geniuses following their disco reinvention, Paul reportedly told his band members that they were using the same three chords as everyone else, just sped up with a drum machine added. This comment reveals his belief that their success was based more on trends than genuine musical innovation. While Paul has never publicly attacked the Bee Gees, his conspicuous omission of them when discussing influential artists speaks volumes about his true feelings. Even during a 2001 tribute following Maurice Gibbs' death, McCartney's statement was notably brief and impersonal compared to other artists' heartfelt condolences, suggesting that the competitive wounds never fully healed. The Beach Boys. The most intense musical rivalry of Paul McCartney's career wasn't with punk rockers or stadium rock competitors. It was with America's sunshine pop pioneers, the Beach Boys. What began as mutual admiration between McCartney and Brian Wilson evolved into a bitter creative competition that music insiders still discuss decades later. Legendary producer Phil Spector noted that Paul and Brian were like two chess grandmasters, with each move one made requiring the other to respond with something even better. What started as a friendly creative relationship turned into an obsession for both musicians. The rivalry began in earnest after McCartney heard the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album in 1966. According to Beatles producer George Martin, Paul was both inspired and threatened by what he heard. Martin remembered that McCartney played the album constantly, analyzing every note and arrangement. Then Paul would say that the Beatles needed to go further than what the Beach Boys had achieved, which directly led to the creation of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. What truly damaged the relationship was Brian Wilson's abandoned Smile album. When Wilson shelved what many considered his masterpiece due to mental health struggles and creative pressures, McCartney was allegedly dismissive of Wilson's inability to complete the project. Beatles roadie Mal Evans recalled Paul saying that if someone couldn't finish what they started, they shouldn't be in the music business. He believed that real professionals pushed through difficulties no matter what obstacles they faced. The tension between the two musicians reached its peak during a disastrous 1967 dinner party at Brian Wilson's home. McCartney reportedly criticized several Beach Boys songs as being too simplistic and suggested that their famous harmonies had become predictable. According to Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson, Paul left the dinner thinking he had given helpful feedback to a fellow musician. However, Brian Wilson didn't speak for days afterward, showing how deeply the criticism had affected him. Over the decades, this rivalry transformed into something much colder and more distant. When asked about the Beach Boys' influence in a 1993 interview, McCartney conspicuously minimized their impact on the Beatles' development. He acknowledged that they created lovely harmonies, but thought people overstated how much the Beach Boys had influenced the Beatles. He claimed the Beatles were already well on their way to their own innovations before hearing the Beach Boys. Even in recent years, when discussing God Only Knows, a song he has called perfect, McCartney can't resist adding qualifiers like for American pop music or of that period. These additions reveal a competitive edge that time hasn't dulled, even when he's praising Wilson's work. As Beach Boys historian David Leaf observed, Paul respects Brian's musical abilities, but he will never fully acknowledge how much Wilson's work pushed him and the Beatles forward. Admitting that level of influence would mean acknowledging that someone else was a major driving force behind the Beatles' evolution, something McCartney seems unable or unwilling to do. These musical rivalries reveal a side of Paul McCartney that contrasts sharply with his public image as a diplomatic and gracious musician. Behind the scenes, he was intensely competitive and protective of his artistic legacy. Whether dealing with direct competitors like the Rolling Stones and Beach Boys, or dismissing what he saw as inferior imitators like the Monkees and Oasis, McCartney's private opinions show how seriously he took his role as a musical innovator, and how determined he was to maintain the Beatles' position as the most important band in popular music history.